Hi, I'm Stephen Jones. My colleagues and I were trying to address the question of how can we make better recommendations for uh, intervening in or resolving group conflict. And my colleagues are Shah, Randall Peterson, and Amanda Ferguson. But as we got into this question, we realized we really don't know enough about what's happening inside the black box of group conflict. And so we said, how can we recommend conflict resolution strategies if we don't understand the origins of intergroup conflict? Well, what do I mean by origins? Consider the four network diagrams on the right. In each of these, there are 5 people in the team, and the ties between the individuals is a conflict tie. Notice in the top left network diagram that there's one individual that all of the conflict ties stem from. This is an example of one individual being the cause of the conflict inside the team. In the top right network diagram, there's 2 individuals that have conflict, a dyad, while the others in the team are merely observers of the conflict. In the bottom left network diagram, we have 2 subgroups highlighted by the shaded areas. And across those 2 subgroups, there is conflict. And so we're seeing subgroups of people disagree with one another. And then finally, in the bottom right network, we have whole team conflict, where everyone has conflict with everyone else. Each of these is an example of intergroup conflict. But the current literature doesn't make distinctions between these different origins. And so this was then our task to move into this. Now, there's been implicit assumptions that we often assume the intergroup conflict is shared, uniform, and static. And so we really haven't had to think about the origins of conflict before, because everyone kind of perceives it as the same. Everyone's kind of involved in similar ways. It's kind of static over time in a similar way. Well, researchers have begun to challenge this, right? Some work on conflict asymmetry has recognized that perceptions can be very different. Work that's looked at dyadic conflict inside teams has said, well, it's not uniform. We need to think about how people are maybe experiencing conflict differently. And then others have been advocating for a more dynamic view of conflict. And so this forms our research agenda we've been working through. The first question, where does intergroup conflict originate, is what I want to talk about today. We have other questions that we've also addressed. How does it evolve over time? How do origins and evolution of conflict relate to traditional assessments? 4, how do origins affect team performance? And I'm excited to say that we address these first 4 questions in a forthcoming article in Administrative Science Quarterly. The title is Things Are Not Always What They Seem: The Origins and Evolution of Intergroup Conflict. The 5th question, how do we resolve conflict at different origins, is something that is part of our continuing research, and we're seeing some interesting results in some preliminary studies we've done where it looks like resolving conflict, it does matter where the origins are. So we didn't have a lot of theory to guide us in our studies, and so we took an abductive approach where we created some plausible conjectures based on the existing literature. This is where we came up with our 4 origins: individual, dyad, subgroup, and team, as well as 3 evolution trajectories: continuity, contagion, and concentration. And so we used these then to guide our research questions in a series of 3 studies. In study 1, it was we asked executives and students to tell us and write about a conflict experience in a team. And then we coded those narratives to be able to identify the origins of conflict in the team. Study 2 and 3, we use a social network approach. And in study 2, it was looking over the life cycle of a project teams. And study 3 we went into a Chinese manufacturing firm and looked at their teams. So let me talk a little bit about the four origins. So an individual origin is about the source of conflict being derived from a bad apple, someone with chronic behaviors that impair the group, or a principal dissenter who is driving the group to try to think more critically. The dyad, this can be where you have personality clashes between two individuals, a miscommunication, perceptual differences that happen within a dyad and a team. The subgroup follows the literature on social categorization and fault lines, also coalitions. Literature deals in these warring factions inside teams. And then finally, at the whole team level, this is where our traditional ideas around a uniform conflict experiencing that is shared because of the social context and because of the routinized patterns of interactions that can happen within teams. Now, one of the questions you may have is, well, how did you do the social network analysis to be able to identify origins? What we did is we developed an algorithm that was able to compare the actual social networks in a team to some idealized or stylized conflict configurations in teams that clearly identify an individual dyad subgroup or team origin. And then we compared all of our social networks using these configurations to identify the source or origin of conflict in the teams. We delve into this a lot more in the forthcoming paper to describe it. The results of the three studies are strikingly similar. You can see in study 1 in the red bar that the dyad was the most common origin of conflict. This was in the qualitative study of executives and students. And also in study 2 with the project teams, we found again the dyad was the most common source or origin of conflict, both for task conflict and for relationship conflict. And then in study 3, in the manufacturing firm, again, the dyad, both for task and relationship conflict, was the most common origin. Individual and subgroups, shown in blue and green, were the next most common in a relatively similar amounts. And again, strikingly, it was very similar across study 1, 2, and 3. And then interestingly, the team origin of conflict was the least common, maybe about 15% in study 1, in studies 2 and 3, even less than that. And so we found very little evidence of team conflict in the kind of traditional approach of it's uniform throughout the team. We found it much more common to be isolated to specific dyads or specific cause of an individual or between subgroups of individuals. So we really don't have evidence of it being shared nor uniform. And we have a lot of evidence that it's primarily within dyads. We have very little evidence of whole team conflict. This really is going to push us, we feel, as a field, to have to rethink about how we conceptualize and measure intergroup conflict. And we, in the paper, take a lot of time in the discussion to ask additional questions and to provide some ideas about where we might go next as we study intergroup conflict, recognizing that the origins of conflict can be really important. Thank you very much.